Wow. And so what do you see kind of like the biggest challenges that we're facing, or that the community has to face, has to overcome in the short term and long term?
Well, what we're seeing today, one of the big obstacles for the neurotech industry, there's a couple of key factors. One is reimbursement. How do we get through the third party payer process to make that economic value? That's a big hurdle right now for the industry. I think we're making inroads to try to solve that problem. We're starting to see some creative pricing models come out. This I call it the printer model, right? So in the tech days of printers, which it still exists today, we sell the printer for really cheap, but we sell the ink cartridge for a lot, and that's how we make our cash flow. Some of these non-invasive devices, we're starting to see that. We're starting to see, oh, well, let's sell you the device, but then the treatments that you buy is where we create our cash flow. So reimbursement is a key issue, and how do we get around that? I think another one is actually training the clinical community, because a lot of clinicians are not taught technology in medical school. It really has to be a specialty or a passion of theirs to get into. So I think it's training the healthcare community to be comfortable with this space, and be able to recommend and properly diagnose. So I think those are kind of the two big hurdles that we're seeing right now. But there's also drivers that's driving the growth. We're having an aging population, right? We're starting to see the regulatory environment become much more conducive for devices. We are starting to see the population to be able to accept technology. So I think there's hurdles, but there's also benefits for growth.
Wow. Excellent. That sounds like a great field to be in.
Well, we're starting to see, we always focus on the research and how exciting that is. But at the end of the day, we make lots of investments in research and technology. Our investments are thrown away if we don't get that technology to the people that can actually benefit from it. And why do we make those investments? Is because we want to improve the health of the people living with these neurological conditions. And the more that we can do to move the devices out of the laboratory and into the marketplace so that people can access them, the better off we are.
Through that valley of death, right?
Through the valley of death.
Through the valley of death, where things they're on the bench. They work on the bench, but then to get it to the bedside, it's a bit of a gap, and in terms of funding and usability and everything like that.
So let's talk about the valley of death,
okay.
Right? So a lot of people don't know what the valley of death is. So typically a device is created into the laboratory. It's proven, it's a little proof of concept, and now we have to get to human clinical trials. That's one valley of death of how do we make that transition from laboratory and animal models and modeling into a human. And a lot of times researchers are not willing to do that, or they don't have the resources to be able to do that. So what happens? That technology dies on the bench and it never gets into the human trials. So that becomes a key issue. Where do we need to make that investment? That's where NIH comes in. That's where private foundations come in. That's where some of the early investments come into these early stage human trials to be able to prove that it's a viable. We just lost a light.
We just lost a light.
Okay. This is how we create a viable device that says, yeah, we can go into humans. That's one valley of death. The next valley of death is, okay, now that we're in humans, how do we get over the hurdle to be able to make it a commercial device? That's a big valley of death. And there's a lot sitting on the bottom of that valley, some very viable devices that just have never been able to make it onto the market space. So what's helping with that? The tech transfer movement that we're starting to see, that tech transfer offices are helping with that. These incubators that are coming, that are growing in the area, these accelerators, these business accelerators that are starting to kind of help pull up some of these startup ventures to get over that valley of death and into commercialization.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely necessary. And do you think that a lot of these companies at the bottom of the sea that, like you said, could have been saved had they utilized the resources effectively, or do you think it was just inevitable?
I think the environment was different then. I mean, it really was. Let's take an exciting device that I was involved in. It's the OFS device. It was the Andera oscillating frequency stimulator for people with paralysis. That device had a proof of concept. They restored 1 to 2 levels of function for people with spinal cord injury, and they had the data to prove that. And they also restored sensation, right? So they had the data for that as well. The regulatory environment was very different then, and also what outcome measures that they used didn't meet those requirements. Because what happens is, and it can make it really complicated, but in evaluating spinal cord injury, it's called the ASIA scale, doesn't account for sensation. So how do you measure and objectively measure sensation, right? So one of the key things are, what are the tools that we use for outcome measures to be able to get through the regulatory process? We saw this with North Star as well. It was a device for stroke, and they didn't meet their primary outcome measures. So the company went out of business. Was the technology at a proof of concept? Did it help people? Absolutely. But it didn't meet those outcome measures, so the company went out of business. I think times have changed. I think our tools that we're using for outcome measures have changed. I think our environment has changed. So maybe there are some technologies that are in that valley that we can bring back out and can potentially be, key pieces. The book isn't written on that one yet. That might be, hint to those people out there that, entrepreneurs, there might be technology out there that already has the proof of concept that might be able to be picked up.
Dust it off, and let's go round 2.
Modernize it and go to round 2. It might be out there. So